Quite a good turnout. Yeah, these events are heavily student. Pardon?
Okay, afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming on this beautifully sunny day and for joining us for today's discussion on the topic of dry run for war, how Fukushima changed Japan and its place in the world. My name is Tony Seish, and I'm the director of the Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia here at the Kennedy School. But first, before we get into the meat of today's subject, I want to start with a couple of announcements on behalf of the Ash Center before I hand over to our moderator, Professor Haddad. First, the Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Secondly, I'd like to thank our co-sponsor of today's events, the program on U.S. Japan Relations at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Edwin O. Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies at Harvard University. So as people are aware, today's discussion is actually being live streamed and recorded, and it will be publicly available on the Ash Center's YouTube channel at the conclusion of the session today. Because we also have a remote audience for today's discussion, please, if you are making comments or raising questions, which we hope you will do, we'd like it to be spoken into a microphone. Otherwise, those who are watching in won't be able to pick up the comments. Finally, I'd just like to briefly introduce our speakers for today's discussion. As you know, we have with us, very luckily, unfortunately, Martin Fackler with us, who's been a writer and journalist in Asia for some 2 decades, working most recently as an assistant Asia editor at the New York Times, managing papers coverage of China. Most pertinent for today, he was correspondent of the New York Times for 10 years, serving as the Tokyo bureau chief from 2009 to 2015. And in 2012, he led a team that was named finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for investigative stories into precisely the Fukushima nuclear disaster. It said in the committee that it offered a powerful exploration of serious mistakes concealed by authorities in Japan. Next to me is Arn Howitt, who's a senior advisor at the Ash Center and the co-director of our program in crisis leadership, jointly sponsored by the Ash Center and Taubman Center for State and Local Government. Arn works extensively in a whole range of executive education programs dealing with managing crises, co-chairs or chairs programs on leadership in crises and leadership in homeland security and a number of other related programs. Arn and I have worked very closely on developing programs in China, in Indonesia, and now most recently on developing teaching programs in Bangladesh. And then finally, I want to hand over to our moderator, Professor Mary Alice Haddad, who is the Johnny Andrus Professor of Government and Director of the Office of the Faculty Career Development and Professor of East Asian and Environmental Studies at Wesleyan University. Current work focuses on city diplomacy, environmental politics, with a focus on East Asia, particularly China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And early research had focused on civic engagement, democracy, citizenship, volunteering, and non-profit organizations. So with that, let me hand the floor over to Professor Haddad, please.
Thank you so much. And thanks all. It's great to see a great audience. As you know, we're coming in, we've passed the 10-year mark on this tragedy and disaster, which then actually gives us enough time to kind of look back and reveal some of the things that weren't visible at the time and see what was going on. So just to give you a sense of how it's going to flow, Martin's going to speak for 40 minutes, 30 minutes. We're hoping to get as much time as possible for Q&A. Arn will make some remarks, putting the context of the Fukushima disaster in a disaster management, crisis management mode, and then we'll field some questions from the audience. Take it away.
And can you hear me? Is this on? Thank you all for coming today. Thank you, Mary Alice, for the introduction, and thank you, Arn and Tony, for coming and for the introduction, Tony. As Mary Alice said, my name is Martin Fackler. I'm going to talk today about the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And let me see if I can get the technology to work. It is working, good, okay. It's always good when technology works, and maybe that's a good lead off to this particular topic, which was a time when technology didn't work. So thank you to the Ash Center, Reischauer Institute, and to the Weatherhead Center for sponsoring this event. Thank you for Tony for giving me the chance to come to Harvard. So as Tony said, briefly, when this accident began, and I say began because it's not over. When it began 12 years ago, I was a journalist in Tokyo. So I covered this at close range on the ground. My first time in Fukushima was March 12th, the day after the earthquake. And I covered it for the next 4 years for the Times. I covered it intermittently after that for the Times. And more recently, I've started to write a book about this. I'm working on a book about this. This is very much a work in progress for me. I'm still learning. It's an enormously complex disaster. Frankly, there are a lot of things that are still kept hidden. There are a lot of things that are still secret. And one of the challenges in doing the book has been trying to figure out what actually happened in many cases. There are a lot of themes I could look at, but the theme I'd like to look at today really is one of the kind of crucial sort of questions that came out of the accident, and one that seems appropriate for the Kennedy School of Government. And this was the decision that Japanese leaders had to make about whether and when and how to send people into harm's way, right? How did Japan get to making these decisions, asking people to risk their lives to get the plant under control? If you remember Chernobyl, right? If you guys saw the HBO series, the firemen, the liquidators, right, who had to go in to get the plant under control, and many of them paid the ultimate price, right? During Fukushima, this was a possibility. It was something that it was faced at several levels. It was faced on the ground at the plant. It was faced in Tokyo at the national level, and it was faced indirectly in Washington, D.C., as we shall also see. It's a big deal in Japan. It's a big deal anywhere, but it's a particularly big deal in Japan because Japan had never really had to send people into harm's way, really since 1945. Its security has been guaranteed by the United States, which has 50,000 armed personnel or uniformed personnel stationed in Japan. Japan is a very peaceful, civilized society. You don't get shot at school. You don't get shot on the way to the shopping center. You don't deal with these things usually. And so this was really, I think, a very powerful moment for Japan. This was an existential crisis. And I think that the decision to finally send people in, to finally risk lives, changed Japan in certain ways. And I'm going to touch on some of that. The Cliff Notes version of the accident. The largest earthquake in Japan's recorded history struck off the coast of northeastern Japan, 2:46 p.m. on Friday, March 11, 2011. The earthquake was large enough to change the rotation of the Earth. The Earth's axis shifted 6.5 inches on that moment. Every day since then has been several microseconds shorter. The most deadly outcome of that seismic event was the tsunami, the huge waves that were produced by the movement of the Earth. These waves slammed into northeastern Japan. They ravaged hundreds of miles of coastline. They killed more than 18,000 people. So when we're talking about Fukushima, you got to remember, Japan was facing what was already a devastating national catastrophe. And on top of that, then they had the nuclear disaster. The tsunami and the earthquake struck the plant. This is actually a photo of the tsunami striking the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. It was 120 miles north of Tokyo, facing the Pacific Ocean, the plant, right? It knocked out power at the plant. And when they lost power, they lost control of the reactors. 3 reactors melted down. You may remember on TV the huge hydrogen explosions as these buildings detonated, right? These are massive buildings. To give you a sense of how large they are, these are 2 of them. This is the Unit 3 building and the Unit 4 building. And you look in the lower left-hand corner, those are 2 18-wheelers, like huge flatbed trucks. And these are buildings like the size of the Assembly Building at Cape Canaveral, if you've seen that, big windowless cubes that detonated. The first human character we're going to meet today is Yoshida Masao. He was the plant manager at Fukushima Daiichi. He was really the first person to face this question of sending people into harm's way. And on the ground at the plant, he had to do this quite early. He made his first decision to actually send somebody into the plant and actually risk their lives early in the morning of Saturday, March 12th. But he's really dealing with this issue at a much earlier stage. In Tokyo, which is really what I want to focus on, the main character in our drama is Kan Naoto. Kan is a very interesting character. In Japanese, he's known as Irakan, Kan the Irritable. He's famous for his explosive temper. He's a bulldozer. If you've ever met him, he just plows right through people. He was an opposition party prime minister, which is significant. Japan has largely been governed by the same party ever since the end of World War II, or the predecessors of the current party. Since 1955, the Liberal Democratic Party has governed Japan almost continuously. One of the few times it didn't was this time. So you have an opposition party with very little experience in governing the country, finds itself in charge of Japan during the biggest existential crisis in the nation's history since MacArthur landed in 1945. Kan had a history of battling the bureaucrats, the kind of elite government officials who actually run Japan. His party had a very is a very broad party, and there are many different folks. It was a big tent, but it had a lot of folks who are very skeptical of or critical of the Japanese military, the self-defense forces, because of some even question the constitutionality of Japan having a military. His party was also critical at times of the relationship with the United States and the dependence on the United States. And so these all play a role. But Kan is the first person to really deal with this question of sending people into harm's way. So what happens? We mentioned how at the plant, when the earthquake and tsunami struck, things start to spin out of control. You have reactors melting down, you have buildings exploding, right? Things are going sideways. Something similar happened in Tokyo, a meltdown of a different sort. The government agencies that were supposed to be in charge of responding to a nuclear accident essentially failed. I can talk more about this in the Q&A if you're interested, but for the sake of time, I'll just talk about one, which was NISA, the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency. This was the NRC of Japan, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission of Japan. This was their main nuclear regulator, right? This was supposed to be the center of nuclear knowledge and know-how in the Japanese government. It's part of METI, one of the most powerful ministries in Japan. NISA basically fails. The fellow in the photograph with the white hair, this is Terasaka. I believe his given name was Nobuaki. Terasaka was the head of NISA. When the accident happened, he goes to the Kante. The Kante is the prime minister's office. It's the White House of Japan. Terasaka goes to the Kante with a stack of papers and a bunch of underlings. And Prime Minister Kan very quickly realizes this guy really doesn't know what he's talking about, doesn't have a lot of information about the plant, doesn't really even know how nuclear reactors work. Kan blows up at him, gets angry, and asks him, so who are you? Why are you here? You don't know anything about nuclear power. Terasaka-san answers, well, in fact, I'm an economics major from the University of Tokyo. I really don't know nuclear power. I'm not an engineer. Sorry. He's a career bureaucrat who is basically being cycled through NISA. Khan blows up at him and kicks him out of the Kante. Basically says, get this guy out of here. Send me somebody who knows something. NISA is a no-show from that point on. So the main Japanese nuclear regulatory agency no longer plays a role in the Kante, especially around Prime Minister Khan from that point on. So imagine, the NRC, imagine Greg Yatsko getting kicked out by President Obama. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Khan is forced to throw out the script. This accident is so far beyond what the government has been planning for, what they've been training for, what they've been thinking of, what the manuals say, that he's forced basically to improvise. He does several things, but the one that perhaps folks remember is on the morning of March 12th, he gets in a helicopter and he flies up to the plant, right? He flies up to Fukushima Daiichi. He then goes into the plant, he confronts the plant manager and starts demanding to know, why is the response so slow? What's delaying things? What's going on here? What are you doing? Now imagine if Joe Biden got into Marine Corps One, flew up to 3 Mile Island, went into the nuclear plant there during an accident, and started berating the guy in the control room. That's literally what happened. And interestingly enough, Khan actually liked Yoshida Masao. This is the guy we saw a moment ago. Khan actually came away with a very good impression of Yoshida. Yoshida had a very different opinion of Khan. The crisis really starts to really hit a climax March 14th, the evening of March 14th, 3 days after the earthquake. My interpretation of events, this is one of those episodes that basically is still covered up. My interpretation is that the CEO of TEPCO is the company that owns the plant, Tokyo Electric Power Company. It's basically the electrical utility company for Tokyo, right? Supplying electricity to Tokyo. TEPCO's CEO, Shimizu, calls up top officials in the Khan administration. Basically, my interpretation, he was trying to start a conversation to broach the idea, when do we start pulling people, when do we evacuate the plant? The plant is getting dangerous, the things are getting worse and worse. We want to protect the lives of our people up there. When do we actually need to start talking about evacuating the plant? He wasn't saying he wants to pull them out right away, but I think he wanted to start a conversation like that. Word of this gets to Khan, right? This is now 3 a.m. in the morning of March 15th. Khan was asleep. Very bad time to anger Khan. Khan wakes up, he's furious. He goes ballistic. What happens next is one of the most dramatic moments of the disaster. Khan marches into TEPCO's headquarters in Tokyo. This is like 4:30, 5 a.m. in the morning, gathers all the executives together. He bullies them, he pleads with them, he berates them, he criticizes them. But basically, he's got one message. You guys need to stay. You cannot pull out. He says, if TEPCO pulls out, then TEPCO is history. And not only is TEPCO history, then Japan is history. And he actually says this. He says, our sovereignty is at stake. If you guys pull out, a foreign power, hint, hint, or foreign powers will come in and take over and do this for us. And so he's basically saying, Japan rests upon you. Now think about this. He's basically asking employees of a public utility company, a power company, to risk their lives to stay and to protect Japan. But that was his first answer to this question: who will risk their lives? Who will put their lives on the line to protect Japan? Another interesting fact here is that at this point he is completely off the script. Okay, there's no legal basis for any of this. There's no legal basis for the government of Japan to order the employees of a private electrical company to risk their lives. Nothing. I mean, he's completely off script. He's persuading, he's bullying, he's cajoling, but he's doing what he thinks he has to do. You know, I've kind of poked fun at Khan a little bit. I've met him several times. I know Khan, but he, you know, I'm not sure that other prime ministers would have done a whole lot better, and most might have done worse. So, but at a crucial moment, he does act, and so I do want to give him credit for that. At the plant, this is Yoshida Masao again, right? The plant manager. At the plant, Yoshida is also facing similar decisions. Who is going to risk their lives? Okay. He decides to send most people away from the plant. He's got about 700 people still there early in the morning of March 15th, okay, 4 days after the earthquake. And he sends more than 600 of them away. He has 69 stay. And the 69 who stay, that's like a skeleton crew. And he's basically, you know, it's basically all the old men, right? All the veterans, right? They stay. And 69 people is just enough to run. They've set this operation up to get water into the reactors. What they've done is none of the pumps work anymore. None of the machines at the plant work anymore. They've brought in fire trucks, okay? And if you think of a building like in the US too, right, an office building, you have those outlets or inlets, I guess they're called, right? You can hook the fire hose up to it and you can pump water in and it goes through the sprinkler system, right? Same thing in the buildings at Fukushima Daiichi. So the fire trucks go up, they hook their hoses up, right, to these inlets. They're pumping water in. He's cooling the reactors via the sprinkler system. That's the only way he's got. There's no other way to get water into the buildings. The water is going through the sprinklers. Now, these are heavy-duty sprinklers, but nonetheless, they're going through the sprinklers. To run those fire trucks, he's got maybe 8 or 9 fire trucks at this point, in 3 lines into 3 melted down reactors. He needs the 69 people are the minimum number of people he thinks he needs to check those trucks, to put diesel fuel in those trucks, to make sure that the hoses don't break, make sure the trucks keep running, right? This is the origin of the Fukushima 50 that you probably heard about, right? These 69 people. Now, he's barely got enough to run the fire trucks that are putting water into the melted down reactors. The problem is later on March 15th, a new problem emerges involving the spent fuel pools, right? And we can talk more about that later if you like, but just it's a new problem and a very serious problem and a very dangerous problem. And he has a phone call with Hosono Goshi, who is Khan's point man on responding to the crisis, right? And so he's on the cell phone with Hosono, and basically Yoshida says, we can't do anymore, okay? I can't handle the spent fuel pools. You know, we have been doing this for 4 days. No one's come to help us. We got our hands full. I got 69 people or whatever we're working on. We're doing the fire trucks, but we can't do the spent fuel pools. You guys have to send people in to help us. Send in the military and the self-defense forces. And if the self-defense forces don't come, call the Americans. And that's literally what he says, call the Americans. Okay, that's a good segue to the Americans. As you folks may remember who were watching in those days, there was a lot of frustration in the US, right? So the US has 50,000 armed service personnel in Japan, several bases, right? And there are several bases close to Tokyo. The US is, in the beginning, is very frustrated by the lack of information, right? Japan is telling the US nothing, basically, or giving them contradictory information. I can talk about that if there's interest. Now, what's really happening is that breakdown on the Japanese side that I described is a big part of this, right? The Americans can't see this, but the Japanese government is basically paralyzed. So, but from the American perspective, no information's coming to us. The Japanese don't trust us. They're lying to us. They're not telling us what's going on. Frustration is rising. John Roos is the fellow in the photograph with the stars and stripes. He's the ambassador to Japan. You know, John is in the, talking to people, trying to get people to give him information. The US takes matters into its own hands. It sends global hawks over the reactors. It sends satellites over the reactors. It sends a team from the NRC, led by this guy in the bottom, Chuck Casto, into Tokyo. It sends people from the Department of Energy. At the same time, there's also a growing alarm in the United States that Japan is failing to take action. You have this nuclear plant. It's now day 4, day 5. No one is going in to help them, right? What is going on? The US Navy within the US government is the first one to really sound the alarm on this issue. The US Navy has 2 nuclear-powered carriers near Japan. USS Ronald Reagan, which is off the coast of northeastern Japan, part of Operation Tomodachi, right? This relief effort for the tsunami. There's also the USS George Washington, which is in port at Yokosuka, which is the big US Navy base near Tokyo. These carriers have very sensitive devices for picking up radioactive particles in the air, okay? The Reagan hits a plume off Japan on March 13th, 2 days after the earthquake. It hits a plume in 3 different points, actually. They're able to triangulate that the plume came from Fukushima Daiichi. The fact that there's a radioactive plume more than 100 nautical miles out at sea tells them that the plant is in a lot worse shape than the Japanese have been telling them. On March 15th, the George Washington detects a plume at Yokosuka. The plume at Yokosuka is more serious, it's more powerful. It contains cesium. Cesium is a byproduct of nuclear fission, right? So when uranium splits, you eventually get cesium. It's inside the reactor, okay? It's inside the fuel rods. If you've got cesium floating around in the air, what that means is that the stuff inside the reactors is out in the atmosphere, okay? This means that this accident is quite serious. The Navy hits, they start talking about how serious it is. They're inside the US government saying, hey, listen, this is much worse than you guys think it is. This is really bad in Fukushima. At the same time, across the US government, alarm bells are sounding because of this saga over the pullout. Remember, we had the TEPCO was talking about pulling out, right? This was reaching the Americans via various channels internally and also via the media. And it comes on top of this concern that the Japanese aren't acting fast enough. They're not doing enough, right? Now they're talking about pulling out. Are you crazy? So the reaction is quite strong. I can talk about, 2 things happen. I'll talk about one later if there's interest, but the US breaks publicly with Japan, saying that it's much more dangerous than Japan says. You need to evacuate out to 50 miles. Japan had been saying 12 miles. For the purpose of our topic, the second thing is more important. This was not public, this was private, behind closed doors. The US starts to lean on Japan to take action. One of the phrasings that a top US diplomat came up with is heroic measures or heroic actions. The US starts pushing Japan to take heroic actions, heroic measures, i.e. risk people's lives to get this thing under control. March 15, March 16, you get to the point where in Tokyo, Prime Minister Kan, folks know they need to act. At the plant, Yoshida, the plant manager, Yoshida Masao, is saying, hey, we can't do this anymore. You need to help us. And you have the Americans knocking on the door and saying, hey, you guys need to take heroic measures. At the same time, there's a lot of reluctance, right? This is an opposition party. It's a party that has a very sort of conflicted view of the self-defense forces. But ultimately, it's the military that they decide has to act. And so, and the military, by the way, is very reluctant. The self-defense forces are reluctant. This is dangerous. Plus, this is not the US military, right? These guys don't have nuclear reactors, right? They don't do reactors, right? So ultimately, though, the decision is made to send in the Japanese military, the self-defense forces. On March 16th, they take 2 Chinook helicopters. They load them with, they call them buckets, but they carry the water below the helicopter. They use it for dumping on forest fires, right? And they're going to drop water on the reactors. They send 2 Chinooks to Fukushima Daiichi, and they fail. The 2 helicopters hit radiation that's too high. The self-defense force has an internal guideline of how much radiation they can be exposed to. For the purpose of this flight, they decided on 250 millisieverts per hour. The helicopters detect radiation in excess of that level, and they abort the mission. They turn back. They fail to drop the water. It kind of gets papered over now, but at the time, this was actually quite dumbfounding. Hosono-san, the guy I mentioned before, has told me that he was depressed and shocked when this happened. You know, he was actually in TEPCO's headquarters. They were watching it on the TV screen. And he was like, he couldn't believe it. He's like, you know, he thought for a moment that maybe Japan really can't do this, right? It wasn't only in Tokyo that people were alarmed at this. Admiral Mike Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, calls up his Japanese counterpart, General Oriki, right, who is the Bakuryocho, the Japanese chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and gives him a very forceful pep talk. Says, listen, your nation is in crisis. Japan's, you know, fate is on the line. You guys, you know, only the military can take action. It's up to you guys. It's up to the military. You guys have got to do this. So the next morning, March 17, they send the helicopters, 2 different helicopters, but they send the helicopters in again. I've talked to the pilots of those helicopters. They were quite scared, but they did it. They actually go through with it. They actually drop the water. They're told to drop the water no matter what. Doesn't matter what the radiation levels are, go do it. Now, whether the water actually mattered or not is a different question. Yoshida Masao, the plant manager who's watching this on closed circuit TV, called the water drop cicada piss. These were insects pissing in the wind. That was basically his assessment. The significance of it, though, was just the demonstration, the political value, right? So that the self-defense forces had finally taken action. The government had finally sent in help to the plant, and they had finally done something, right? Later that day, they begin to start something that feels more like a whole of government response. You get police agencies, fire departments, the so-called hyper rescue unit from Tokyo. Tokyo's kind of elite fire unit. The self-defense forces, they start to go into the plant. They start to put water, shoot water via water cannons up into the reactor buildings. Over time, they set up a forward staging center at J Village, which is the national soccer training stadium that happened to be 12 miles south of the plant. It was actually built by TEPCO as a gift to the people of Fukushima. And over a couple of days of trial and error, the self-defense forces are actually put in charge on the ground around the plants, around the reactors. Anyway, so finally the government is acting, the government's there, and Yoshida and his remaining workers are no longer alone, right? I think we've come to the time, as I promised you, Mary Alice. I'm going to do 30 minutes. I will have, just let me raise 2 kind of outcomes, kind of long-term outcomes, and I'll stop as I promised. One is, I think one of the outcomes of what happened is the status, the reputation, the acceptance in Japan of the self-defense forces, I think changed quite dramatically after the accident. It wasn't just Fukushima, it's also the tsunami, and the self-defense forces played a large role in the response to the tsunami. But after the accident, the self-defense forces are much more accepted by the public. They become more visible. They are also more accepted by the political leadership as a tool of policy. You see this in the self-defense forces taking larger and larger roles in their joint maneuvers with the US. You see this in Japan beginning military alliances with other countries, most prominently Australia. But you also have the Quad with India, the Philippines, they're selling stuff to Vietnam, et cetera. The other big change is, in one sense, I think that Fukushima makes possible the return of Abe Shinzo as Prime Minister of Japan. As you may recall, Abe, in his first stint in power, belly flopped. He quit within a year. He had an agenda that was about historical revisionism, and it just didn't fly with the public. Public wasn't interested. The second time around, he's much smarter, much better. He focuses on the economy. Remember Abenomics, right? He also, though, has this agenda politically of what I call a statist agenda, which is strengthening the organs of state in Japan, strengthening the ability of the Japanese government to respond to a crisis, right? Centralizing command and control within the government. For example, he creates a Japan-style National Security Council. What I think Abe had in mind was not another natural disaster, but he was thinking more about China, the Senkakus, East China Sea, and later on Taiwan. And he was really thinking about the next crisis might be external, it may be diplomatic or whatever. And so he really wanted to get Japan ready for this. And if it had such a terrible time with this disaster, it really needed to get its act together if it was going to handle itself in a much more dangerous neighborhood in East Asia. So I'll stop there, Mary Alice. I think I kept my promise. But thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much. We'll turn it over to Arn.
Thank you very much, Mary Alice, and thank you, Martin, for such a vivid description of what happened during that crisis. Let me put this in a more general perspective about how societies build the capacity to respond to major emergencies or even crises of the sort that Martin is describing. On the one hand, most of the emergencies that society faces are anticipatable. We see floods, we have seen earthquakes, we have seen even tsunamis, and certainly fires or events that involve firearms or explosive terrorism attacks, or et cetera. And so what is the standard way that society deals with that kind of emergency, which my colleague Dutch Leonard and I have labeled routine emergencies? These are distinguished by what I said, that they are anticipatable. They're things that we've seen before. And as a result of that, societies develop organizational systems that have specialized capabilities. And these bureaucracies are able to plan for these kinds of events. They're able to recruit, select, and train personnel who can carry out the things that are needed to be done. They can practice responding, both in exercises or simulations, but they also get real-world experience repeatedly because these are recurrent kinds of problems. And when that happens, they're able to do after-action reviews, figure out what worked, what didn't work, and refine those. So when an emergency comes along, they know what they're facing. They have a good idea of what they need to do in order to deal with it. They have people who are ready to do it, and they have plans so they can execute those plans. And obviously, for any particular emergency, that has to be customized, sometimes substantially, but they're ready. And typically, there are bureaucratic organizations that are specialized for that particular kind of thing, and they can do it more or less on their own. What distinguishes the kind of situation that Martin described, a crisis? It has genuine novelty in some fashion. And so what do I mean by novelty? There are at least three ways in which situations can develop that, several of which I think are visible in this instance. The most common form of novelty is the size of the event itself. It might be much larger than what societies, organizations have planned for. And we certainly see this in the beginnings of this emergency in the form of an earthquake that is larger than anything that's Japan has seen in its recorded history, or at least its memorable history. We see a tsunami that is so much larger than what Japan had planned for. And this is a country that is perhaps among the 2 or 3 best prepared countries for emergencies in the world. This is not a developing nation that has limited capabilities. A second element of novelty might be something that is simply new under the sun. And of course, all of us have faced COVID over the last 3 years, and we understand how novel events can throw us into crisis. And the final method, the third way of thinking about this, would be a complex combination of events where two or more things happen more or less simultaneously, perhaps any of them could have been handled, but when they happen together, they create a crisis. Japan experienced that in spades. It was you have a gigantic earthquake, a horrific tsunami, and now a nuclear crisis that Japan has never seen. So what are the consequences for decision-making and action that I think are illustrated extremely well by what Martin has described? First of all, there's very poor situational awareness. People simply don't know what happened. My little research team interviewed people at the municipal, prefectural, and national level. All of them said that for days they lacked information about what happened in the areas affected by the tsunami in particular, but also, as Martin has described, in the nuclear accident. Secondly, there is no plan ready to deal with these kinds of situations, no systematic way of responding to it. Almost always crises of this sort require cross-organizational collaboration that is very intense, and yet often they are not prepared to have that kind of collaboration. And Japan has a very stovepiped government system, and so that kind of cross-collaboration is unusual. It also requires a great deal of adaptability and improvisation. I think Martin described extremely well the dilemmas that Prime Minister Khan faced, and he described how Khan began to improvise and adapt and push others to do the same. Another example that we could talk about was the Director General of the Tohoku region where the earthquake occurred, of the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, and Transportation. He negotiated with his minister back in Tokyo and basically fooled his minister into giving him a great deal of discretion, which he would not ordinarily have had. And then he dispatched his, he had 3,000 workers who did highway repairs and other kinds of infrastructure work in that region. He dispatched them to the coast with the instructions, do whatever you need to do to help the local governments. Don't limit yourself to your normal duties. Don't limit yourself to what we are actually legally responsible for. Just do anything that will help these areas that need that kind of help. So the question is, how do we prepare for these kinds of events? They're never easy to deal with, but there are a number of ways that we can do that and improve our capacity to be adaptable, flexible, and improvisational in the face of things that we've never seen before. Let me just list them, and I'm happy to talk about more of them if others are interested. One is that we have to practice cross-organizational collaboration. We have to imagine situations in which different agencies will have to work together intensively under very dangerous circumstances. Secondly, we need a system that will organize that collaboration. The United States, since 9/11, has developed something called the National Incident Management System, which is based on incident command system that it has asked all emergency organizations in the United States to adapt. Japan does not have a similar system, and in fact, at several stages has rejected developing such a thing. Secondly, organizations need to scan their environment in order to identify things that they may not have seen, but others in fact may have experienced, as the United States no doubt has been scanning the experience of the Fukushima disaster. Think about what they would do if faced by that kind of situation and develop their own plans, essentially trying to push something from crisis into the more common routine emergencies. And finally, practicing out-of-the-box scenarios, even if they're far-fetched. The importance of it isn't getting ready for that particular scenario. It's having the people who will respond practice working together, practice making decisions quickly, practice figuring out where the opportunities are to be able to handle something that was unexpected. when confronted with perhaps a very different problem, those kinds of lessons will be very valuable. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. That's a great talk and great follow-up comments on putting it in perspective. I'm going to exercise the right of the moderator to ask the first question, and then you can all think about your own questions. Martin, you talked about how Fukushima and the response afterwards has sort of fundamentally changed Japan in some key ways. And I was wondering if you could reflect or think a little bit about whether or not the Fukushima events have changed the world. Sort of, I remember at the time the disruptions related to supply chain management that happened over Fukushima led to a lot of changes afterwards that maybe made the COVID supply chains not as bad, or maybe it didn't affect it. Similarly, you talked about military interoperability. NGO response was also both crowdsourcing information from grassroots and also large NGO. There was just a lot of coordination that happened. And so I'm curious whether or not you see Fukushima as a sort of big shock to the system, everybody's kind of crazy for a moment, and then you sort of respond and kind of go back to normal, or whether the Earth axis happened in a broader sense, and there's a lot of stuff now around the world that really aren't the same because of what happened. And then Arn, sort of related to you, your last set of remarks are, because of what we've studied in Fukushima, we need to. And my question for you is, Fukushima was one of the best studies disasters, and your team was among the many experts that went in to sort of see what was going on. Have you seen the not just we need to, but we are? Sort of, have you seen the Fukushima response actually change the way disaster management is now happening around the world? So that to both of you, thank you.
Shall I go first?
Please.
Yeah, good question. Thank you, Mary Alice. I mean, I think if you look at kind of the immediate effects globally, the U.S. was talking about a nuclear renaissance on the eve of the Fukushima crisis. And I think that has been set back, to say the least. But in terms of like longer term issues and kind of bigger issues, I think there are two things that kind of came out of it. Both of them are kind of bottom up, actually. One is citizen science. So when I really didn't talk about what happened on the ground in Fukushima, the evacuated towns, the people who were affected by it. But it was quite remarkable when they were getting no information, just like the rest of us. You know, they had no idea. They're being told to evacuate. No one told them where. No one told them why. I mean, besides the accident, but how bad it was. People started to figure out how to measure stuff. People started to buy dosimeters. They started to buy devices. You got these kind of grassroots citizen science movements appearing. And, you know, these are like mushroom farmers. You know, these are people like housewives, you know, or just regular people, you know, not nuclear experts. These aren't PhDs in nuclear science. And they are learning what a becquerel is versus a millisievert. They're learning how to use these devices. One of the most sophisticated non-government laboratories that exist today for measuring the radioactivity in food or in samples is run by a former housewife. It's called Taruchine. It's in Iwaki, the city of Iwaki. They can test not only gamma, but they can test beta. Beta is difficult to detect. They got very high levels of proficiency. You had things like SafeCast, which was started by a group of expats in Tokyo who were doing a kind of a crowdsourcing of nuclear data. They built these little devices like the size of a smartphone that would detect gamma radiation levels, broadcast it, you know, via a cell phone chip back to a central database, and they're making these maps, right? And you have this device, you stick it in your car, you carry it with you every 10 seconds. It's broadcasting a data point. And so they have millions and millions and millions of data points now around Fukushima, around Japan, and now around the world. kind of this regular people taking the power of science into their own hands to empower themselves and make decisions. And that you saw this in Ukraine when the Russians, I was going to say the Soviets, when the Russians moved into Chernobyl. Safecast, the same group, was sending dosimeters to Ukraine, and people were trying to measure whether there's any impact from the war on Chernobyl. You know, and this sort of making of maps and this sort of this need to use science to empower yourself. It's a powerful lesson, and it's one that in the U.S. we really need to have in an era where people deny science. Another thing is Fukushima was the first social media disaster, right? It's the first major disaster in the world where you watched it on Twitter and Facebook and this kind of stuff. It was the first disaster where you had fake news. It was the first disaster where you had parallel realities that were completely disjoined. These things that we're now very familiar with from having these, they happen later in our own country, in our own political system. A lot of these things, I saw them for the first time in Fukushima. I saw them for the first time, the narratives around radiation in Fukushima, right? You had, millions are going to die versus, it's safe to drink the water and go surfing. And, it was the white and black extremes, right? You saw that on social media and two parallel universes or multiple parallel universes. So I think these things began with Fukushima and are here with us to stay, but they really are kind of grassroots sort of impacts that the accident had on society at large.
I think that this kind of disaster, but also similar kinds of large-scale events, have definitely had an effect on the way emergency management is carried out in a number of different countries. In the United States, we certainly have looked again at the question of the safety of nuclear plants and have stepped up our efforts to do planning for potential disasters in the existing nuclear plants, although slowly and perhaps not sufficiently. I think even more powerful in the US have been natural disasters like Superstorm Sandy that hit New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey in 2012, the events of 2017 in which Houston was overwhelmed by Hurricane Harvey, then Florida and other southeastern states were affected by Hurricane Irma, and fast on the heels of both of those, Hurricane Maria, which devastated Puerto Rico. And what we learned was that even our national emergency preparedness system was exhausted by these events, had insufficient supplies, et cetera. And we've taken steps, halting and insufficient, I'm afraid, to deal with that. And I think these kinds of things have been shaped in other countries. I know a fair amount about China as well. China has done immense improvement of its emergency management system in recent years, particularly since the SARS epidemic in 2003, the huge blizzards in 2008, and the earthquake in Wenchuan in 2008, and has done very much to increase planning, training, creating a ministry that pulled together many separate agencies. And you can see these things in a number of other countries. I think the big question is whether we're staying ahead of the potential emergencies. And we have also what one might call chronic crises like that are particularly affecting the developing world, things like famine, civil conflict, drought. And while the world is at least moderately good at sending aid to these places, it is very difficult to sustain that over the long period of time and to deal with the people who are displaced by these kinds of events. This is certainly, as climate change tragically advances, this is going to be a huge challenge for the world.
Thanks so much. We're running a little low on time, so what I'm going to do is collect a few questions, and then I'll turn it over and allow for responses. Try to keep your questions short.
Thank you. This is Jay from Ash Center Fellow. Today I learned a lot of new information I never heard before. For example, from Martin, I know there is a period of time, their lack of action. And then from Professor Arn, I know they even lack of information. My question is, for making decisions, what kind of power or force make them change? What is the turning point for making decisions to just take actions? Is the media, is the pressure from outside, from inside, or order from somebody? So what is the force to make them to take actions in a period of crucial time? Thank you.
Thank you for a great discussion. I'm Ken Matsumura Jr. from Japan, Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so my quick question, after attending this event, everyone is understandably cautious about operating nuclear power plants in Japan. However, in light of the recent war in Ukraine, which has caused fuel shortage, and the summer electricity shortage is caused by not running nuclear power plants, there is a growing acceptance in Japan, regardless of generation, for the restart of nuclear power plants. I'm asking to Martin, do you think this situation is dangerous, or do you think that dependence on nuclear power is inevitable in resource-poor Japan? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Jenny. I'm a Master of Public Policy student at Harvard Kennedy School. And I have two questions. Number one is kind of dialing before the accident. What was the crisis response and management for especially Daiichi reactor? And second question, building on Ken's question, what are some of the major challenges and risks for Japan to develop nuclear energy after the accident? Thank you.
Last one.
Okay, thank you very much. This is G from Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. I'm asking, how do you see the Daiichi Fukushima crisis as a real game changer, or it's only an accelerator for the holistic reforms, especially in the terms of the revision of the statist approach by Abe, the concentration of power to the Kante. Also, let's say the maybe improve the coordinated relationship between the self-defense forces and the U.S. Army, U.S. Navy. So I mean, for me, it's more about very consistent Japanese policy, especially after 2012, is very consistent with the democratic period of time, especially in terms of security policies. So I mean, it's more about a response. I mean, after Abe, it's more about a response to the change of the environment rising from China, maybe especially taking into account of the Senkaku Islands conflicts. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for all the excellent questions. Should I just take them in order, do you think? Or, I think the turning point, that's a really good question, because I think that if you talk to folks on the U.S. side, they'll tell you it was the U.S. I think Japan's leaders had figured it out before that. I think Yoshida Masao figured it out pretty early, and I think Khan had figured it out by March 15th. So I mean, I think the driver is simply the fact that if we don't get this thing under control, it's going to get much worse. I think it's just the stark reality was the driver. Things weren't working, status quo wasn't working, and the reason why one of the good things I'll say about Khan is that he's rare in Japan. He's a self-made man. Most of the Japanese politicians are second, third, fourth generation. He's and he's a very strong personality, as I said, but he was somebody who was capable of throwing everything out the window, ripping up the script, and taking action on his own. And I think he took action before. It wasn't the U.S. that drove him into action. He saw the writing on the wall that this was going to get worse and worse. He was worried about Japan's sovereignty. He was worried that people would take action. Hosono, the fellow I mentioned, told me that he was worried that Japan faced a second occupation. And so there was a concern that the world outside Japan would take action. The best movie on Fukushima, by the way, is Shin Gojira. right?
Yes.
That's the best movie on the new Shin Godzilla, right? It's by far the best movie on Fukushima, because Godzilla is the plant, right? And you'll see them, they have a committee meeting, they go across the hall for another meeting, they have a third meeting, nobody's acting. And then finally there's this fear of the foreign countries coming in, taking over, so that's, you know, that's a great sort of parable for what happened. But they knew it. I think it was internal, and I think it was like they just saw that this was going to crash and crash bad if they didn't take action. So it was kind of necessity. It was just like this brick wall of reality, right? On restarting nuclear power plants, you know, I think, you know, the Ukraine has changed the game a bit, right? Global warming and the need to reduce carbon, right, has changed the game quite a bit, right? I think, you know, nuclear plants, you know, I'm fine with restarting them. I think that there are two issues, though, that we have to think about, right, with nuclear plants. One is the issue that this crisis brings up, which is how do you deal with the black swan events? These are enormously complex machines, right? Enormously complex. And when you get things this complex, it's like the space shuttle or whatever, you know, it's like you unforeseen combinations of failures and events can come together and just blow everything up. And that's what happened at Fukushima. So you have to be able to, you know, that's kind of what Arn was talking about. How do you train for black swan events? You have to, my concern with Japanese nuclear regulation and TEPCO is that, did they learn that lesson? How do you prepare for the unforeseeable? And you have to prepare for that, right? That's the lesson of Fukushima. The second thing is very different. The problem with nuclear power plants is that we haven't solved the problem of waste, right? It's like building a toilet without a plumbing system, right? You know, where do we put the waste? And I haven't really seen a good answer to that yet. So if we do start turning these things on and start using them again, we got to figure out where do we put them. Do we bury it deep underground? You know, this stuff is going to be radioactive for 100,000 years or something. How do you tell people, you know, hundreds of thousands, whatever generations in the future, don't dig here, right? You put a skull and crossbones, you know, maybe in the future that's like a party invitation. I don't know. You know, you don't know what symbolism, what language is going to be, right? So anyways, those are the two things I think we have to address head on if we do restart. Crisis management beforehand. Japan had crisis management, but it was, you're always fighting the last war. So the last big nuclear accident in Japan was 1999, the JCO accident, which was two guys put plutonium into a bucket. They put enough plutonium in the bucket that it hit criticality, and they got fried by neutrons, and they basically died horrible deaths. And they had to evacuate an area around that laboratory where the plutonium hit criticality. And so they had set up all of their disaster planning around an event like that. So they did have disaster planning. One of the things I didn't mention was the offsite center. They had was supposed to be a kind of an intra-agency coordination center just off the grounds of the plant, about 3 kilometers away, called the offsite center. And you know, this was supposed to, and for an event like that, where, you know, a couple people got killed, there was a limited evacuation, that was enough. At Fukushima Daiichi, though, the accident was so much larger. The offsite center itself, right, where all these police and fire and folks were supposed to be gathering, was well inside the plume. So you had and this was a building that had no shielding, no air filtering for radiation, no fuel, no energy, no electricity. It lost power. You had radiation levels of 1,000 microsieverts per hour outside the door. You had 30 microsieverts per hour inside. And by the way, the natural background radiation in Japan is 0.05 microsieverts an hour. So this is hundreds or thousands of times natural background radiation. It just fell apart. The offsite center was a complete failure. People ran away, basically. So they had things in place, but they were kind of focusing on the last accident. They hadn't kind of thought about a worst case scenario or anything like that. And there's this whole question of the safety myth that people in Japan believe that it couldn't happen in Japan, like a lot of countries, right? Nuclear power industry in a lot of countries believes that a severe accident is impossible. And so they just weren't ready for it. And then Japan's response, right? I do think, I mean, China is obviously the driver, right? I think Fukushima Daiichi was just a wake-up call that, you know, if we can't handle a disaster like this, what are we going to do when the Chinese land on the Senkakus, right? And so I think it was a wake-up call that their crisis management, their ability to respond just wasn't there. But I think that the real threat or contingency that Abe was thinking about, I believe, I'm not in his head, or wasn't in his head, was that the Chinese would take some sort of action, or perhaps North Korea, right? You've got North Korean missiles flying over Japan from time to time. So I think it was an exterior threat that he was thinking about, and that was the live driver, certainly, I think. But Fukushima was sort of a wake-up call. Like, you know, we can't deal with this. How can we deal with that? That's how I see it.
Let me quickly respond to a couple of questions, build on the question about the risks of nuclear power. I think that certainly there in most countries that have used nuclear power extensively, that there have been efforts to think much more clearly about emergencies and how to respond to these things. I think there are reasons for concern. There's a classic book by Charles Perrow called Normal Accidents, much of which deals with the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island in the United States in 1979. And the argument of that book is that in complex systems that have certain characteristics of which nuclear plants do, that there is a non-trivial probability that accidents will eventually occur if these systems run for a long time. Some people disagree with that idea and believe that safety systems can be built that will in fact make them safe. Probably that is true, that they can be made safer. Whether the risk can be removed entirely is another story. I think we also have to worry about the degree to which mass construction of nuclear plants create risks simply of inadequate supervision and inadequate capacity. China has on the books to make a number of dozen nuclear plants over a relatively short period of time. The question is what will the construction quality be? Are there sufficient engineers in China to manage, who have the experience to be able to manage those kinds of things? Will they operate safely? Is it possible to train the personnel who can do this effectively? And there's a scale problem for all of those safety features. I also wanted to very briefly comment on the idea of what promotes change. And I think that the important thing to remember is that crises, whether they're a natural disaster or a man-made disaster of one sort or an interaction of both of those, are not only physical events, but also political events. Inevitably, they raise all kinds of political questions. Narrowly, they affect the potential election chances of the people who are in office and their standing in international affairs. But there are subtler effects as well. Someone who a leader who performs poorly in a natural disaster, as George Bush was perceived to do in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, loses political influence, loses the ability to accomplish some other things on their agenda. And it also affects their legacy, which people in very high public office are worried about. How will they be remembered by history? And of course, the international dimension that Martin has referred to is also important in that regard. So I think those are the things that there also are opposition parties which will criticize the performance of the leader and propose ways of improving, hopefully improving the performance in the next disaster. And so those things, they don't guarantee that there will be progress made, but they often generate the kinds of reforms that lead to better performance in the future.
Thanks so much. Please join me in thanking our guests.